We need to talk about what just happened in the last 48 hours because the entire global order as we know it has fundamentally shifted. And if you're not paying attention to this, you're missing the biggest geopolitical realignment since the end of the Cold War. Mark Carney just pulled off something that has Washington completely blindsided. And I'm not talking about some diplomatic nicety or a strongly worded letter. I'm talking about the formation of a massive economic alliance that spans 5 billion people, encompasses some of the world's largest economies, and is explicitly designed to isolate the United States economically. Let me say that again. Canada's Prime Minister just orchestrated what amounts to an economic NATO, and America isn't in it. In fact, America is the reason for it. Here's what happened. 24 hours ago, we started getting confirmation of something that had been whispered about in diplomatic circles for weeks. Mark Carney, in response to Donald Trump's threats to annex parts of Canada, his threats regarding Greenland, and his systematic deployment of economically devastating tariffs, has been quietly building a coalition, not just any coalition. We're talking about the European Union, Britain, Japan, Taiwan, Australia, India, New Zealand, and Mexico. All of them in one massive economic bloc. And here's the part that should terrify anyone who thinks American exceptionalism is a given. They're all signing on enthusiastically. The genesis of this goes back to Carney's speech at Davos. And if you didn't watch that speech, you missed the moment when Canada stopped being America's polite northern neighbor and became something else entirely. Carney stood in front of the global elite and essentially said, "We are not going to let one man's territorial ambitions and economic vandalism destroy the international order." That speech resonated. It resonated with NATO countries who are watching Trump threaten to annex Greenland like we're living in the 19th century. It resonated with European leaders who remember what happens when powerful countries start redrawing maps. And it resonated with Asian democracies who see the writing on the wall when it comes to American reliability. So Carney made calls, a lot of calls. And what he proposed was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. What if we just traded with each other? What if we dropped tariffs among ourselves, pooled our resources, coordinated our economic policies, and created a zone of free trade and mutual protection that doesn't include the United States? Let's talk about the scale of what we're looking at here, because the numbers are staggering. This alliance represents 1.5 billion people. That's not a typo. 1.5 billion people. The combined GDP of these nations exceeds $35 trillion. To put that in perspective, the US GDP is about 27 trillion. This alliance is bigger than the American economy, significantly bigger. And here's what makes it so strategically brilliant. Every single one of these countries was already trading with each other. Carney didn't have to create new relationships. He just had to formalize them and remove the barriers. The European Union and Japan, already massive trading partners. Australia and India, growing trade relationship. Mexico? Well, Mexico has been diversifying away from US dependence for years, and Carney just handed them the framework to accelerate that process. The proposed structure involves dropping tariffs to near zero among member nations. Think about what that means. A Japanese company can now sell to Europe, Canada, Australia, India, and Mexico without the tariff burden. A Canadian manufacturer has access to 1.5 billion consumers with minimal trade friction. The economic efficiencies here are massive. But it's not just about trade. This alliance comes with mutual defense provisions, particularly focused on the Arctic. And that's where things get really interesting, because Canada has been watching Russia and China eye Arctic shipping routes and resources for years. They've also been watching the United States become increasingly unreliable as a security partner. So Carney built an alliance that says, we will defend each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Full stop. If you're wondering whether this is a direct response to Trump's comments about Canada becoming the 51st state, you're not wondering hard enough. This is not just a response. This is a repudiation. This is Canada looking at the United States and saying, we don't need you anymore. In fact, we're better off without you. And before you think I'm exaggerating, let me read you what one European diplomat said on Background just 6 hours ago. Carney has given us permission to do what we've wanted to do for years. We can finally build a global system that doesn't rely on American whims. Permission. Canada gave Europe permission to move on from the United States. Now let's talk about how we got here, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. Donald Trump has spent the last several months threatening Canada in ways that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. He's talked about annexation. He's joked about Canada becoming American states. He's threatened crippling tariffs on Canadian goods. He's questioned the validity of the US-Canada border, and he apparently thought this was good politics. What Trump failed to understand, what his entire team failed to understand, is that Canada is not some minor player on the world stage. Canada is the 10th largest economy in the world. Canada has some of the largest resource reserves on the planet. Canada has deep diplomatic relationships built over decades of being seen as honest brokers. And Canada has something that Trump's America has completely squandered: credibility. When Mark Carney started making calls to Berlin, to Tokyo, to Canberra, he wasn't asking for favors. He was offering a solution. These countries have all watched Trump weaponize the American economy, threaten allies, abandon international agreements, and generally behave like a bull in the global china shop. They've been looking for an alternative. Carney gave them one. And here's the truly damaging part for the Trump administration. This alliance is being framed explicitly as a defense of the rules-based international order. It's not anti-American in rhetoric. It's pro-stability, pro-democracy, pro-free trade, which makes it impossible for Trump to attack without looking like he's against all of those things. Carney has positioned Canada as the defender of the very international system that the United States built after World War II. The irony is almost too much to bear. America built this system, and now Canada is having to protect it from America. Look, I know this is a lot. I know it sounds like inside baseball diplomatic maneuvering that doesn't affect your daily life. But if you care about where this is all heading, if you care about what the next decade looks like, you need to understand what just happened. And if you're finding this valuable, if this is the kind of analysis you're not getting anywhere else, do me a favor and hit that like button. Subscribe to this channel, because we're going to be following this story as it develops, and it's going to develop fast. The mainstream media is still trying to figure out how to cover this without admitting they missed it entirely. We're not going to miss it. So subscribe and drop a comment below telling me what you think about this alliance. Is Canada making the right move? Is this the end of American economic dominance? I want to hear from you. Now, here's where this gets even more complicated, and this is the part that broke just this morning. Canada has officially stated that it will not participate in any potential US-Israel military action against Iran. Let me repeat that. Canada has said no to joining what could be the next major Middle Eastern conflict. This is unprecedented. Canada has been part of virtually every major American military coalition for decades: Korea, Afghanistan, the Gulf War. And now, when tensions with Iran are escalating, when Trump and Israeli leadership are coordinating what looks like potential military action, Canada has said, we're out. The official reasoning is that Canada wants to uphold international law and maintain its role as a mediator. But the real message is much simpler. Canada no longer automatically follows American foreign policy. That assumption, which has been bedrock for generations, is dead. And this ties directly into Carney's broader strategy. By refusing to participate in what many international law experts believe would be an illegal war, Canada is signaling to the rest of the world that it's serious about this rules-based order rhetoric. It's not just talk. Canada is willing to break with the United States on fundamental security issues. Think about what that means for the alliance Carney is building. European countries that are skeptical of Middle Eastern military adventures now see Canada as a genuine alternative to American leadership. Asian democracies that want security partnerships without being dragged into every American conflict have a model in Canada. This is soft power at its most effective. And it's driving Trump absolutely insane. Because the one thing Trump cannot stand is being told no. And Canada isn't just saying no. Canada is building an entire international framework based on saying no to Trump. We need to talk about the Arctic, because this is where theory meets reality, and it's happening right now. Canada has been fortifying its Arctic presence for months. New naval vessels, expanded surveillance, enhanced cooperation with Nordic countries. And now we know why. The Arctic is about to become one of the most contested regions on Earth, and Canada is making sure it has the muscle to back up its territorial claims. Here's what's happening. Climate change is opening up Arctic shipping routes that have been frozen for millennia. These routes cut shipping times between Asia and Europe by weeks. They're worth trillions in economic value. And everyone wants a piece. Russia has been building military bases along its Arctic coast. China has declared itself a near-Arctic nation, which is absurd but revealing of their ambitions. And the United States, under Trump, has made noises about Arctic sovereignty that have made Canadian defense planners very nervous. So Carney's alliance includes specific provisions about Arctic security. Canada, in cooperation with Nordic countries, Britain, and others in the alliance, is essentially creating an Arctic security zone. They're pooling military resources, they're coordinating surveillance, they're making it very clear that Arctic sovereignty will be defended collectively. And they're doing it without the United States. Think about that. The Arctic, which has been a joint US-Canada defense priority since the Cold War, is now being secured by a coalition that excludes America. That's not a minor shift. That's a fundamental realignment of North American security architecture. And it gets better, or worse, depending on your perspective. This alliance is exploring the possibility of joint Arctic resource development. That means Canadian oil and gas, Nordic rare earth minerals, potential fishing rights in newly ice-free waters, all being developed and shared among alliance members with the United States on the outside looking in. Trump threatened Canada's sovereignty and assumed Canada would just accept it because what else could they do? Well, this is what they could do. They could lock the United States out of one of the most economically and strategically important regions on the planet. Let's get into the really nerdy details for a minute, because this is where the alliance becomes a genuine threat to American economic hegemony. The way Trump has used tariffs, the way he's weaponized the dollar, the way he's threatened to cut countries off from American markets, all of that relies on one assumption: that access to the American market is so valuable that countries will endure anything to maintain it. Carney's alliance flips that assumption on its head. What if, collectively, these countries represent a market that's bigger than America's? What if they can trade freely among themselves and diversify away from American dependence? Then suddenly, American threats lose their teeth. Here's a concrete example. Canada exports massive amounts of oil and natural gas to the United States. Trump has threatened tariffs on Canadian energy, apparently believing that Canada has no other options. But within this alliance, Canada can redirect energy exports to Europe, Japan, and other energy-hungry members. The infrastructure takes time to build, but the political will is now there. Canadian energy could flow to Germany, to South Korea, to any alliance member with minimal tariff burden. Or consider manufacturing. Mexico has been terrified of Trump's USMCA threats. But if Mexico can manufacture goods and sell them tariff-free to the EU, Japan, Australia, and Canada, suddenly Mexican manufacturers have options. They're not held hostage to American market access. This is economic deterrence. The alliance creates alternatives to the American market, which means Trump's threats become less credible. And once those threats lose credibility, America loses leverage. And once America loses leverage, the entire post-war economic system that placed the United States at the center starts to wobble. I want you to think about something. Comment below if you think this alliance can actually work. Can 5 billion people spread across multiple continents with different political systems and different priorities actually coordinate effectively enough to counterbalance the United States? Or is this going to collapse under its own complexity? Drop your thoughts below, because this is genuinely unprecedented territory. Here's what makes Carney's approach so sophisticated. He's not trying to replace American power with Canadian power. That would be absurd. Canada is not a superpower and never will be. Instead, Carney is pioneering what he calls a middle powers strategy. The idea is this: individually, Countries like Canada, Australia, South Korea, Poland, and others can't stand up to great powers like the United States or China. But collectively, if they coordinate their economic and security policies, they can create a bloc that's powerful enough to defend their interests and shape international outcomes. This isn't a new idea. Middle powers have been coordinating for decades. But what's new is the scale and the ambition. Carney isn't proposing a loose discussion forum. He's proposing a formal alliance with institutional structures, binding agreements, and coordinated policymaking. He's trying to create a third pole in international relations, positioned between the United States and China. And here's why that matters. For years, countries have felt like they had to choose between aligning with the United States or accommodating China. That binary choice has been paralyzing, especially for democracies that value both security and economic growth. Carney's alliance offers a third option: align with other middle powers and create your own space to maneuver. This is especially appealing right now because both the United States and China look increasingly unreliable. Trump's America is volatile, transactional, and willing to abandon allies. Xi's China is authoritarian, aggressive, and economically coercive. A lot of countries are looking at that landscape and thinking, we need another option. Canada, by virtue of being non-threatening, democratic, resource-rich, and diplomatically skilled, is the perfect country to lead this kind of coalition. Carney understands that, and he's moving fast before the window closes. Let's be very clear about what's at stake for the United States, because the implications are profound. For 80 years, American economic and military dominance has been the organizing principle of the international system. The dollar as reserve currency, American markets as the ultimate destination for exports, American military power as the guarantor of security, all of that has given the United States unprecedented influence over global affairs. That system is now under threat. Not from China, though China would love to replace American dominance. Not from Russia, which doesn't have the economic power. The threat is coming from America's own allies, who are building an alternative system because they no longer trust American leadership. If this alliance succeeds, if it actually creates a viable alternative economic bloc, the consequences for the United States are severe. The dollar's role as reserve currency gets challenged. American exports face higher tariffs while alliance members trade freely with each other. American companies lose access to markets. American diplomatic influence wanes because countries have other options. This is the nightmare scenario that American strategists have worried about for decades. And it's not happening because of some external enemy. It's happening because of Trump's threats and bullying. The Biden administration understood that alliances are America's strategic advantage. The whole point of NATO, of bilateral treaties, of economic partnerships, was to create a network of countries that had a stake in American success. Trump is shredding that network, and Carney is building a replacement. And here's the most damaging part. This is extraordinarily hard to reverse. Once infrastructure is built to ship Canadian energy to Europe instead of the United States, it stays built. Once supply chains are reconfigured to avoid American tariffs, they stay reconfigured. Once diplomatic relationships are reoriented around a new coalition, they're hard to shift back. Trump is creating facts on the ground that will outlast his presidency. We need to talk about why this is happening now, because the timing is not coincidental. Trump's threats about annexing parts of Canada, his Greenland obsession, his tariff policies, all of that has created a political environment where bold moves are possible. Carney isn't having to convince other countries that American leadership is unreliable. They already believe it. He's just offering them a solution. But there's more to it. Global economic conditions are creating space for this kind of realignment. Post-pandemic supply chain disruptions showed countries how vulnerable they are to economic shocks. The Ukraine war demonstrated that resource security matters. Climate change is opening new shipping routes and creating new strategic priorities. All of these factors make countries more willing to consider alternative arrangements. Carney is a sophisticated economist. He was governor of the Bank of Canada and then the Bank of England. He understands markets, capital flows, and economic incentives better than almost anyone in politics. And he's looked at the current moment and realized this is when we can actually build something new. The other factor is China. A lot of countries are desperate to reduce economic dependence on China, but terrified of Chinese retaliation. An alliance of middle powers provides cover. It's not Canada alone standing up to China. It's not Australia alone. It's a coordinated bloc that's large enough to absorb Chinese economic coercion. That's incredibly appealing to countries that have felt trapped between American unreliability and Chinese aggression. So Carney is moving now, while the political conditions are favorable, while Trump is actively alienating allies, while countries are looking for alternatives. In 6 months, the situation might be different. In 6 months, Trump might be out of office, or he might moderate his approach, or something else might change. Carney is striking while the iron is hot. Here's something you might have noticed. Or maybe you haven't, which is the point. The American mainstream media has barely covered this story. You're not seeing this on the front page of major newspapers. You're not seeing extensive cable news coverage, and that's not an accident. There's a profound discomfort in American media with stories that suggest American decline or American isolation. There's an assumption that America is the indispensable nation, and anything that challenges that assumption gets downplayed or ignored. So you get extensive coverage of Trump's latest tweet, but you don't get coverage of the largest economic realignment in decades. Canadian media is all over this. European media is covering it extensively. Asian outlets are analyzing the implications. But American audiences are largely in the dark, unless they're specifically seeking out international news sources. And that's dangerous, because you can't respond to a challenge you don't understand. If Americans don't grasp that the international order is shifting, that the country's position is weakening, that former allies are building alternatives, then there's no political pressure to change course. Trump can keep threatening Canada, keep imposing tariffs, keep alienating partners, and the American public doesn't realize the long-term consequences. That's why channels like this matter. That's why independent media matters. Because the story you're not being told is often the most important one. So, if you value this kind of coverage, if you want to actually understand what's happening in the world, subscribe, share this video, get the word out. Because the mainstream media isn't going to do it for us. So where does this go from here? Because this alliance is still in its formation stage. The framework is there, but the details need to be negotiated. And there are plenty of ways this could fall apart. The first challenge is speed. Carney is trying to formalize this alliance quickly before political conditions change. That means negotiating trade terms, security arrangements, and institutional structures on a compressed timeline. That's enormously difficult when you're coordinating across multiple continents and time zones. The second challenge is internal politics. Every country in this alliance has domestic constituencies that might oppose it. American-aligned politicians in Japan, European leaders who don't want to antagonize Trump, Canadian conservatives who think Carney is being too aggressive. There are fracture points everywhere. The third challenge is China. Beijing is watching this very carefully. On one hand, anything that weakens American influence is good for China. On the other hand, an alliance of democracies that's explicitly about defending the rules-based order is potentially threatening to Chinese interests. How China responds could determine whether this alliance succeeds or fails. But here's my assessment. I think this is going to happen. I think the political will is there. I think the economic incentives are aligned. I think Trump has created such profound distrust among American allies that they're willing to take the risk of building something new. The next few months are critical. We're going to see formal treaty negotiations. We're going to see Trump's response, which will likely be explosive. We're going to see whether countries like Japan and Australia, which have deep security relationships with the United States, are willing to fully commit to this alternative framework. And we're going to see whether Canada, a country of 40 million people, can actually lead a coalition of 1.5 billion people in reshaping the international system. Let's talk about what this means for Canada specifically, because this is Canada's moment on the world stage in a way that hasn't happened in generations. Canada has always been an important country, but it's been important in a specific way. Important as America's reliable neighbor, important as a resource supplier, important as a diplomatic mediator. But Canada has never been a country that shapes global systems. That's been the role of great powers. Mark Carney is trying to change that. He's positioning Canada as the architect of a new international order. And if he succeeds, if this alliance actually works, Canada's international status transforms completely. Think about what that means domestically. Canada has spent decades with an inferiority complex about its place in the world. Too small to matter on its own, too dependent on the United States to chart its own course. That national psychology is about to change. Canadians are watching their Prime Minister stand up to American threats and build a global coalition. That's a powerful national narrative. It also means Canada needs to invest in its own capabilities. You can't lead an alliance without the hard power to back it up. That means defense spending. That means Arctic infrastructure. That means diplomatic capacity. Carney understands this, which is why we're seeing announcements about increased military budgets and expanded foreign service. But there's a risk here too. If Canada positions itself as the alternative to American leadership, it becomes a target, not just for Trump's rhetoric, which Canada can handle, but for more serious forms of pressure. Economic coercion, cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns. Canada is stepping onto a stage where the stakes are much higher, and it needs to be ready for that. Here's the uncomfortable question that I think we need to address directly. Is America's era as the global superpower over? Not in military terms. The United States will remain the world's most powerful military for the foreseeable future. But in terms of being able to organize the international system, to set the rules, to have other countries automatically align with American preferences, is that era ending? I think the answer might be yes. Not because America has gotten weaker in absolute terms, but because the rest of the world has gotten stronger and more confident. And because American leadership under Trump has become so erratic that allies can't rely on it, the thing about international systems is that they're based on trust and predictability. Countries align with a hegemon because they believe that hegemon will protect their interests and provide stability. When that belief erodes, the system collapses. We might be watching that collapse in real time. Not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden crisis, but a slow erosion where countries gradually build alternative arrangements, where American influence wanes, where the international system becomes multipolar rather than unipolar. And the catalyst for that collapse is not Chinese power or Russian aggression. It's American decisions. It's Trump threatening to annex Canada. It's tariffs that violate trade agreements. It's abandoning allies when it's convenient. It's the slow motion abdication of the leadership role that America built over 80 years. Carney's alliance is both a symptom of that collapse and an accelerant. It's a symptom because it only exists because American leadership has failed. And it's an accelerant because it gives countries a viable alternative, which makes the collapse of American-led order more likely. I want to close by talking about why this matters to regular people, because it's easy to get lost in the geopolitics and miss the human implications. If this alliance succeeds, if the international economic system fractures into competing blocks, prices go up, supply chains get less efficient, products become more expensive. The economic growth that comes from global trade slows down. That affects jobs, wages, and living standards, including in the United States. If American influence wanes, if the United States is no longer the organizing principle of international security, conflicts become more likely. The post-World War II era has been remarkably peaceful by historical standards, in large part because American power deterred major wars. If that deterrence weakens, we could see a more dangerous world. If countries stop using the dollar as the primary reserve currency, which becomes more likely if alternatives emerge, that has massive implications for American economic power. The United States has been able to run deficits and print money because the world uses dollars. If that changes, American economic policy becomes much more constrained. These are not abstract concerns. These are things that will affect your life, your children's lives, and the kind of world we live in. And the choices being made right now by Trump, by Carney, by leaders around the world are determining what that future looks like. So pay attention, stay informed, demand better from your leaders, because this is the most important story in the world right now, and most people don't even know it's happening. If this video helped you understand what's going on, leave a comment telling me what you think. Are you worried about where this is heading? Do you think Canada is doing the right thing? Do you think America can recover from this? I want to hear your perspective. And subscribe, because this story is just getting started and we're going to be covering every development as it happens. This is the moment when the international order shifts. This is when history turns. and you're watching it happen in real time.